C5Ms, another 19% more efficient. C-130Js, I can only speak for General Horner, saying that he would really have loved the C-130J there. The actual limiting factors for us were not the planes, they were the loaders. They were Vietnam-era loaders, those things that put the pallets on the planes. So now we have things called tunners and Halversons, and they work remarkably well. They're highly reliable and they're very, very efficient. We didn't have a tanker bridge because the tankers were held for other reasons. Some of them were deployed. The O plan actually required KC-10s. We didn't get the KC-10s beyond 5 until it was very late. It's because it was such a versatile, wonderful plane and they had other reasons to use them. But it was one of those things that you have to catch in a refined conference. 40% of the C5 pilots were AR capable. That's if we knew what off and what time they would get to the rendezvous point, which we didn't. So we didn't have an air bridge, we didn't have air mobility. We didn't have TALCs, we had ALCs, so it was a little different. And so those kinds of things, if we were able to put the stage crews where we had the ability to put stage crews, again, we could have been 22% more efficient by putting them in different places, but the real estate was literally not available to us. And boy, if we had the KC-46, it would be just magnificent. And today we now have a thing called throughput and velocity that has all the lessons learned that we talked about. Next slide. Desert Shield, Desert Storm led to what we have in the Air Force as ACC and AMC, global power, global reach, and it's much, much better. We also have managed to get a properly working JOPS and deliberate and executable planning system and much, much better IT, all from the lessons of Desert Shield and Desert Storm. In terms of firsts, there were so many firsts, they're almost hard to count, but I'll hit some of the high ones. It's the first time we ever activated the Civil Reserve Air Fleet, Craft 1, and Craft 2, and Craft 2 Plus. It's the first time we ever activated our ready reserve force of 96 ships. We used to break out 1 or 2 a year. We broke them all out, starting with some of the best. It's the first time we ever used all of our rail cars. I don't know whether you know that, but the Department of Defense has 1,450 rail cars that are designed to carry tanks on rails, things like that. And we used all of those. First time we ever used our bus motor coach mobility network. All kinds of things. It's the first time we had a hunt for crews for those 96 ships. We had to go bring back 60-year-old McDonald's assistant managers to get back on these ships, and they did it. And it's because we had things like the Seafarers Union and the Longshoremen's Union, who were truly patriots and did phenomenal work for our country. The list goes on, all the way down to picking from General Tunner, recognizing people you wouldn't otherwise recognize. We created medals for commercial pilots and flight stewardesses. It's the only time I've ever been to a medal ceremony where they cried. Next slide. On the Sealift side, much the same. I'll kind of dance through this, but we were very, very lucky because while we were doing military reform for TAC Air, which also included Navy TAC Air, by the way, they were going to do the same thing to them. The other thing was the Navy invested $7.4 billion, and they bought 8 fast Sealift ships. They bought a bunch of roll-on, roll-off ships. That's how the Army loves to put things on roll-on, roll-off ships. We bought a lot of maritime prepositioning and afloat prepositioning, and we made some other ships ready. Those saved our bacon. A fast Sealift ship that is the equivalent of 216 C5 sorties. So do the math, because they completed 34 round trips with the 8 ships, which is extraordinary. That's a lot of C5 sorties that they made up. And they go pretty fast. So that Navy investment was very, very important. All part of that 600 ship Navy thing from 1980, you might remember that. And I already talked about the Merchant Marine and readiness shortfalls, those kinds of things. On 31 December, we actually had a steel bridge. We had one ship every 50 miles headed towards Adamam, the major port that we used over there. Next slide. All right, but go back one slide. From the United States, 560 ships going over there. That's a lot of stuff. When Europe kicked in and bringing the 2nd Armored Division, another 210 ships. But it's not just the ships. It's things like what's on them. Beginning, it was all the tanks and Humvees and those kinds of things. Later on, it was ammo. Ammo is hard to put on a ship. It takes a long time. You got to put in a lot of shoring. Even worse, putting on airplanes. And it's the toughest requirement to get right and to synchronize with the people in the field, because they absolutely have to have different things than they thought they were going to have. It's just the nature of war. Okay, next slide. Getting it from the fort to the port is no mean feat. And total force, things called TTUs, these are the teams that MITMIC sent to all these different ports, Houston, Savannah, Jacksonville, West Coast ports as well. We use the national rail system, the roads and bridges. That is, these things, each one of these would be a briefing in itself. Notice that we use 16,000 rail cars. Those are commercial. 55,000 trucks. By the way, we never had an accident with a truck. We never had an accident with a train or a rail car. So this is extraordinary. Note the number of buses that we used. The number one bus company was actually on strike the entire time. So we had to use secondary systems. Look at the number of trains to get a heavy unit from Europe to the North Sea ports. They were not deployable. They were not ever supposed to deploy. And look at what we used. We used barges, because barges were more efficient than getting them on the road sometimes. So all of these things really add up to an extraordinary story of what occurred. This part was very much like the Berlin airlift because of the weather we confronted and the host nation effects. Next slide. These numbers are not very meaningful because they're so aggregated, but I need to point out that the 500,000 people, 90% of them were delivered on commercial air through the craft. The craft flew 3,600 sorties for us. We flew another 16,500 sorties. When you put it in terms of ton miles, it was the Berlin airlift every 6 weeks from 7 August to 10 March. And we weren't carrying coal and grain. We were carrying extraordinarily difficult things to carry, very, very heavy stuff. We only had one aircraft crash. It was a C-5. One of its thrust reversers opened, taking off out of Ramstein, and we lost that C-5. Normally, we look for a mix of 90% sea and 10% air on O planning. It's part of the deliberate planning process. You can see what we did. The scorecard was 21% air. Why? Air makes up for the sins of others. Late planning, no planning, bad planning. It's the way it is. Forced closure was missed. I talked about that. But still, the patriotic efforts where they had 80% of their stuff. They did an outstanding job of being combat ready, and it really did prove to be extremely effective. One of the things that I didn't mention was that this was also our first container wars. First time we ever used containers to move unit equipment and also a lot of resupply and stuff. And one of the things that you really wish you have, not only on roll-on, roll-off ships or planes or containers, is in-transit visibility. We didn't have in-transit visibility. Those systems were just kicking in at this time. The things we have today, just think about how you can track your bag or your package from Amazon. Oh boy, we wish we had that. And it was truly total force, civilians, Guard, Reserve, and active in every sense. Next slide. Just to leave you with a little bit of leadership, I was asked to do that. I'm sure everyone comes and talks to you about these kinds of things. To me, a good leader today needs to be somebody who listens. I was so impressed yesterday when I finally caught up to the signing ceremonies and got a chance to shake your hand and to see you and understand the caliber of people that are in this room. It's truly extraordinary, and those are not very different than the people you came from and you will go back to. So we have to listen to people, listen to their ideas, be approachable is part of listening. A little tool that I use is I listen for the period in the sentence. If there's a pause and I lose my turn, that's okay. I got to listen, so it's still a good deal. And you should be without guile, no ego. To be to the extreme of being self-deprecating is, I think, a proper American leader today. And then I use the term honor. One man's honor is another man's professionalism. It depends on where you're standing. So you'll know it when you see it. Do it right when nobody's looking. Do it right because you think your mentor is looking over your shoulder. Always do the right thing and always have the courage to do the right thing. If you go through your career and somebody hasn't put their finger in the chest and threatened to fire you, threatened to have you out of town, Washington, D.C., within 24 hours, you probably haven't done your job. So look at it that way. Thank you. By the way, is Jaguar here? She left? Okay. I just wanted to thank her for putting my name forward to be part of this extraordinary group. Thank you very much.
General Kross, we would like to thank you for being here today and sharing your leadership traits with us and your experiences. And so now at this time, we'd like to open the floor up for questions. So if there's any questions, would you take the mics at this time, please?
Good morning, General. Major Campbell, Flight 28. In my estimation, the Department of Defense and the Air Force have slowly increased centralization of command and control in logistics, beginning in Desert Storm. I wonder if you might share with us your perspective on some of the benefits and challenges associated with centralizing command and control for transportation.
Well, first of all, with the extraordinary IT systems we have today, that more and more they talk to each other. They're very dynamic, and it really allows for the benefits of centralized command and control and centralized data so that decisions can be made. The max visibility at every level is really the goal, so that the Iron Major, the Iron Lieutenant Colonel can point out to the two-star who's sitting in the cat, you're about to make a big mistake. And so the data that's down there needs to be up there so that both can see it. And I'm a big fan of that centralized data and command and control.
Sir, I have a question for you. So, in order to do your mission, when we interviewed you, you talked about the importance of relationships. And so, in understanding and looking back on those relationships, my question to you is, what would you do different as it relates to Desert Storm?
That's a very good question, because I think the main thing I would do different is hold or stand up conference calls among absolutely critical personnel so that everyone can hear it. This has become fairly commonplace today, but we didn't really have big conference calls back then. I began my day every day by talking to two of my class of 75 classmates from ACSC. General Mike Ryan, who was the TAC A3, I guess you call it today, and General Howell Estes, who was the SAC A3 at the time. And we'd sort out and make every possible effort to bust through the stovepipes that still existed at that time. And so I think that I would also be on telephone calls with Lieutenant General Gary Mears. He was Colin Powell's J4 on the Joint Staff. And it would have been nice to have a conference call between him, Lieutenant General Dane Starling, and myself, so that we were all on the same page, talking to our seniors and sorting through the day's work.
Thank you, sir. Got one.
Morning, General.
Good morning.
If you had the opportunity to be in front of Congress giving testimony today, what type of warnings might you give about the capacity that we have within our mobility fleet now to fight a long-range fight, maybe in the Pacific?
It's a very good question, but I am not knowledgeable on today's capabilities, so I really can't answer it. I'm sorry. I did, one thing. We had a wonderful time at the game yesterday. With the biscuits. At the beginning was a ceremony with the honor guard, and they brought out the flags. And it's the first time I'd ever seen the honor guard in the state of Alabama, and it reminded me when I was in Vietnam and I was flying the F-4. I flew every one of my combat missions with an Alabama flag in my pocket, right down here, because it's just a beautiful big red X on a white field. And I told my roommate that if I ever got shot down, look for that flag. And we had a special way that we would fold it so they would know that it was me and not my captors. So I do recommend those kinds of little things. It's a real honor to speak with all of you today, and I look forward to being with you for the next couple of days. Thank you.